Whoever had carved the door relished in the anatomy of suffering. It was a 2-story slab of copper set directly in a cavern wall, its surface carved with a vast and complex bas relief that worried the eye. A cloying, confusing mix of human bodies sprawling upwards in a mound of naked flesh. Many glancing horrified over their shoulders were fleeing sometimes out of frame and out of sight. Thousands of them, starved and wretched with gaunt faces and sunken eyes, jutting ribs and distended bellies. There were rumors that they had moved, but only when you weren't looking. Less than a week after its discovery, they brought it down with explosives, and we didn't really know what we found at that point, although I'm sure a few of us, particularly the religious, had their suspicions. The door was wrong. All wrong. It just shouldn't have been there. Natural caverns don't go that deep in Britain. Not 1,000 meters. As scientists, we should have been excited, but we all agreed that the door was repulsive. Staring at it for too long induced a powerful urge to flee. An ancestral memory, maybe. The same way our bodies know how to avoid things that crawl and slither. Things that rot and buzz and stink of death and decay. They never told us why they found it, nor why the project was classified. Only that we had to figure out what was on the other side. When the charges finally blew, they went off like giant firecrackers, a string of them that ran around the gateway, and one by one, deafening booms that shook the entire cavern. And I was left blinking dust out of my eyes as great machines lowered the door, now free of its couplings to the ground. Looking back, some details came easier than others. The air that wafted out was hot and dry, and I was not surprised. That seemed intuitively correct. Whether I'd admit it to myself or not, the fact was that I'd been thinking of the door as a gateway to hell pretty much since I first laid eyes on it, and my mental image of hell was oddly medieval. I expected great big stone walls, something reminiscent of an ancient castle, rattling chains, the wailing of the damned, the stench of sulfur, God, even little red devils with horns and pointy tails. But I hadn't expected shelves and books. That was the first real thing that we saw. Shelves lining the walls that had been dug directly into the same rock as the cavern. Shelves that rose far above our lights so that when we looked up, there was only darkness and dust, but no limits to the endless rows and rows of shelving. Every last inch covered in books. And there were no gaps. Just dust and tattered spines of random sizes, leather, fabric, paperback, faded pastels, and gold leaf letters and alphabets both familiar and strange. And it wasn't just the walls. The floor was littered with random head-high piles of books all stacked up like some tired librarian had gotten fed up of finding room for them. They made a labyrinth of the place, obscuring corners and doors. And the forward team, myself included, progressed carefully along the stone passageway, listening and looking carefully for some signs that would make sense of the place. There must have been thousands of books, and that was just the first hallway that we explored. Whenever we took one out, we found paper so thin it was nearly translucent, and often inked with strange shapes and letters that I could not recognize. Otherwise, it was gibberish. Not that we hadn't studied them so long on the first day. Whenever I took one, I returned it quickly. Lifting them up, I always had the strangest sensation that I was doing something wrong, inappropriate. And I didn't like the space that they left behind on the shelves. A gap like a missing tooth, the darkness within swirling like deep waters. Safety in that place felt like an illusion, and touching the books was at risk of shattering it. I don't know how else to put it except I didn't want to do anything that might draw attention to me. It was as if we were extremely conspicuous. There were no sounds, but those that we had made. Our own breath and our own footfalls. The shuffle and the scuffle of our every movement. We could even hear each other's heartbeats. The discordant bump of several people's chests beating like a broken drum set. And every now and again, a racing. A steady increase in the beat's cadence as we turned a blind corner or lifted a book just to see what it contained or looked up at the shadows above us. Each of us kept having false starts because there was always this expectation that you were going to see something. Soon. Any second now. Squeezed between two books or dangling overhead. It took 6 more hours before the corridor opened up. And when it did, we were dumbfounded. We emerged into a vast and terrifying mezzanine made of ancient rock, overlooking a chasm with no visible bottom. Just floor after floor filled with shelves filled with books. Millions. Billions. And all along those distant walls and stories were little openings that led to more corridors like the one that we just emerged from. So many that it was like staring at a roughshod beehive. To look up or down or anywhere was to be faced with more books than anyone could read in their entire lifetime. We took our first break on that mezzanine. While radios didn't go very far in that place, we'd had the sense to carry enough wire to allow for a hard connection to use that we contacted the main research site and updated them on the situation. We were to keep going for another 6 hours and turn around. A day, no more. That was the plan. And even that felt like too long. I wanted to leave. I wanted to confirm that somewhere was a doorway that we led back to reality because ever since I'd entered that place, it felt like I'd entered into a nightmare. A place where reality was plastic. And I told myself that it was simply the scale of it all. The weirdness. But it was more than that. The very air down there felt thin. There were 6 of us. 3 scientists and 3 soldiers. The soldiers responded to the situation with silence and alertness that bordered on paranoia, constantly scanning the dark with their rifled-mounted lights, flicking the beams from one high shelf to another, fidgeting and exchanging dark looks. In a way, I was thankful, but it put me on edge too. And I couldn't relax at all for the first half of our little break. I guess it was natural that the scientists got talking. This was partly to fill the quiet, but also partly to try to convince ourselves that we were excited about the implications of this find, whatever those may be. Rewriting history, archaeology on a new level, that kind of thing. It didn't take long before we were convincing ourselves to take a closer look at those books. And I'll admit, it didn't come easy, but we did a pretty good job at convincing ourselves that we weren't really afraid. We started slowly, taking one book down, opening it, and then quickly replacing it. But then, with false bravery, we took more and more, and came down until each of us sat cross-legged with several books stacked up on either side, waiting to be read. And I remembered at some point I must have grown tired and looked from my own pile because I noticed Dr. Aisling muttering quietly as she traced some words with her fingers. "What have you found?" "It's a Latin alphabet," she said. "The first one I actually recognized the letters for. German, maybe." None of us were linguists, so we were simply doing our best. But upon hearing Bea mention German, one of the other soldiers came over and looked at the open page. "Germanic, but not German," he said. "You speak it?" And he nodded. "My father is German, and I don't know what this is, but it isn't German." "Any of it sound familiar?" Bea asked while handing the book to him. And after a brief nod from his CO, Lieutenant Mickle took it and began flicking through the pages. "I think that this is the word for death. Sort of rough misspelling, maybe. This one is... I guess it's a bit like wanting. Desiring... I don't know. None of these words seem like they're in the right context either." So there are a variety of languages and alphabets, but as yet nothing that we can make sense of. What about you? Any luck? Bea asked me, and I looked down at the book currently open in my hands. Some kind of Cyrillic, maybe, I shrugged. I don't know. We definitely need Dr. Sellers on the next expedition. I'm sure that he can offer some insight. What about you, Dr. Rosenstein? The third scientist in our group, a little bald man, had been sitting quietly the entire time that we spoke, frowning at one of the several books that lay open before him. I assumed that he was just curious, like Bea and I. Grant, I said, trying to get his attention. Hey, Grant, have you found anything? And his silence unnerved me. He wasn't just captivated. Sweat was prickling his forehead and veins bulging along his temple. He had gone pale, and his eyes were wide and his lips cracked and dry. The soldiers picked up on the strange signals that I had and stood a little more upright. Dr. Rosenstein, one of them asked nervously. Doctor, can you hear us? The nearest soldier reached out and placed a hand on Grant's shoulder, and the little man looked up at us like he hadn't even realized that we existed until that moment. At first I thought that he was relieved, the way that he stared at us with a dumb grin on his face. But I soon realized that something wasn't quite right. Oh, he said with an anxious laugh. Oh, right, of course. His eyes darted between us. Of course, sorry. I didn't mean to alarm you. Right, I said. Well, we're just talking about the books. Bea thinks that hers might be in some kind of German or Germanic language. And he nodded, like this made perfect sense. Yes, I imagine so, he replied, looking around the shelves that towered over us. Lots of languages, I'd say. And then, without really missing a beat, he added, They're sins. And the group fell into silence as each of us tried to make sense of what he had just said. And in the meantime, he stood up and stretched, like it was the most natural thing in the world. What are you talking about? I said once it became clear that he wasn't going to elaborate. It's fairly obvious what they are, he said while leaning forward and eyeing us darkly. And these books are a list of our sins, one for each of us. So there will be books in German, both contemporary and historic German, like the one that you found, Dr. Eisling. But there will also be books in Russian and French, Arabic and Chinese. Not just contemporary tongues either. Ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, Babylonian, Aramaic, Latin, and of course lost languages. Ones that we never found but exist anyway. All of them. All the transgressions of the world are right here, recorded in the sinner's original tongue. But now the soldiers had stepped a little closer, and Bea and I were sharing deeply worried looks. Grant seemed to be in the middle of a breakdown, speaking frantically and anxiously, convinced of his own meaning while not really saying anything of sense. Grant, I think that we really need to go back. The real fun is that you will find books in languages that don't exist yet, he blurted. This isn't just a record of sins in the past, but all of them. Every last one. Even the ones that we haven't committed yet. Grant, I'm going to have one of the men go back with you. Is that okay? I think you might not. These are mine, he said, while gesturing towards a book in his hand. All of them. Not just the things that I did. Petty transgressions all recorded with names and places and even little diagrams. But there are even sins that I only ever thought. Things I wanted to do and... sins I've yet to commit. He flicked through the pages at random and giggled maniacally at something only he could see. Although there aren't many. he cackled as he turned to the final page, tears welling in his eyes. Just one, actually. The last one. The last sin I'll ever commit. Grant, I said, I think you... And before any of us could react, he dropped the book and took a running leap over the nearest edge. This is the way that we came, right? Bea stood at the threshold of a corridor, her light tracking a wire that snaked into the darkness. That's the cable that we carried in with us, one of the soldiers said. But the young man looked over to his CO, Lieutenant Mickle, who had a compass in hand and didn't look happy. It's not the direction that we came, the older man said. We came south. We need to head north. That would be this doorway. He nodded at a second corridor embedded in the rock wall. This has to be the way, Bea said. I trust this cable a hell of a lot more than I do the compass. Anything could be interfering with that thing. Besides, we know the cable leads to HQ because it's still working. We spoke to them only a few minutes ago via this wire. It has to lead out of here. That does make sense, I added. But I marked the way that we left with a piece of chalk, and that mark is over here. I pointed to a third doorway. Regardless, I vote wire, Bea thought. I trust it the most. It's a physical connection. I guess I vote wire too, Nickel added. All right, me as well. But what do we do if we're wrong? What does this even mean? Did something move the wire? Or the door? And we all went silent for a moment as we contemplated this. When nobody offered an answer, I eventually grabbed my backpack and I hauled it up. I guess that we have no choice either way. Do you think that there's really a book in here for everyone? Bea asked, and it was the first any of us had spoken in a few hours. So far, we had all been walking, fixated on the gloom ahead and behind us, watching carefully for some sign that our fevered imaginations were right to suspect something lurking in the dark. Grant seemed to think so. Then what are the odds that he picked his own book out? I mean, if he's right, there are what, 100 billion books or so? More. If he's right about the library containing future sins as well as past. Pretty slim odds, then. What are you thinking? If he did find it here, I don't think that it was coincidence. Up ahead, one of the soldiers came to a sudden stop. Fist raised, he muttered something to the others who knelt and lifted their rifles, aiming at the dark. What is it? Don't you hear it? Miko called back. And all of us stopped and listened carefully, straining to pick up some meaningful sound from the white noise of blood rushing through our ears and the thumping of our own hearts. And sure enough, it was there, a gentle rustling. And without speaking, all of us moved as quietly as we could along the corridor until we came to the source of the strange noise. A door, one that had not been there on our way in, left ever so slightly ajar. Rifle raised, one of the soldiers used his barrel to nudge it open a little further.
Oh shit!
The sound came as a shock, and Miko pulled him back, ready to admonish, when we all saw what had been waiting on the other side. Another corridor, only this one had shelves lined not with books, but several heads. Dissected, pale and gaunt. Row after row. All sitting neatly next to one another and evenly spaced. Their skin paper white in the harsh glare of our lights. And all of them had cloudy eyes. And they were speaking. Subtle voice. Little whispers. They muttered in a discord of wet lips. No breath. No lungs. only the actions of rubbery jaws to sound out syllables and consonants that were lost in the rustling cacophony. Sound was horrific. Wet and dry and deeply unsettling. It worked its way under my skin until I felt the strangest urge to lash out at the heads. But curiosity overrode disgust, and I approached one, wincing briefly when it fixed me with its cloudy eyes, but it didn't stop. I got close enough to see every detail of its flaking skin, its rheumy eyes glaring at me with such strange emotion. And for my own sanity, I reached out and I picked it up. And nothing with disgust how the stump of its neck left mottled brown fluid on the shelf behind. I guess I just wanted to know if it was fake. But its skin was cold, and its brow furrowed with anger at my touch. And as soon as it was in the air, every other head stopped their muttering and fixed me with such foul expressions, I quickly put it back down again, relieved when the muttering resumed. Still, its eyes did not leave me. "What the fuck?" Bea whispered. "What is this?" Mikkel asked as he scanned the upper shelves with his torch. And on they went, as far as we could see. "What the actual fuck is this?" Slowly, a strange thought began to form in my mind. "Blink if you can understand me," I said while kneeling down to look at the head that I'd picked up. Everyone else in the room suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned to see the results of my little experiment. "Blink." Okay, I repeated while trying to calm myself down. "Right. Okay, once for no and twice for yes. Do you understand?" Blink. "Right, okay, I looked to the others for suggestion when Bea piped up instead. "Are these books a list of all of our sins?" Blink. "One book for one person." Blink. "So what are you?" she asked, and this elicited a scathing look from the severed head. "Yes or no questions," I told her. One of the soldiers, the youngest one, the one who'd helped translate the German, stepped up and spoke. "Is this hell?" Blink. "Is this your punishment?" he added. Blink. "If this isn't the punishment, what is?" And all of the heads stopped their muttering and began to emanate the strangest noise. Their faces twisted upwards and warped into grotesque parodies of joy, while their mouths moved up and down in a peculiar sort of rhythm when I realized what they were doing. And I felt a terrible sensation of cold dread creeping down my entire body. They were laughing at us. There was no door. The wire slipped through a tiny hole at the base of the wall that blocked off the corridor. All of us were stunned into silence for minutes until at last Lieutenant Mikkel shook himself free from the shock and issued an order. "Davis, get HQ on the line." One of the soldiers knelt down and began to remove the communication set from his backpack. Within a few seconds, it was up and he was already speaking into the headset. "HQ, can you read me? Over."
I can read you."
"Well, I guess the wire still leads to HQ," I said. "Try checking the walls for seams," Mikkel told me. "See if it moves, hidden images or something, I don't know." Then turning back to the soldier with the handset. "Tell them that we've encountered an obstacle and we want them to send another team in to get us. Tell them to also bring explosives. If this thing opens," I said while running my hands along the edges, "I can't see how, it's pretty solid." And unlike every other wall that we had seen so far, this one was made of red bricks. But that didn't mean that it was somehow mobile either. It seemed as sturdy as any other brick wall that I'd come across. "Well, it came from somewhere," Bea cried while trying to peer through the hole the wire disappeared through. "Damn it, I can't see anything." "HQ," the soldier said. "We're going to need some assistance. There's an obstacle. Over."
Roger that. What is the obstacle?
A wall. Tell the next team to bring explosives. Over.
A wall?
Just send the team ASAP. Our way out is blocked. Over.
Confirming that we are en route to your position. Just one question. Over.
What is it? Over.
Why do you keep saying over?
And suddenly the voice changed. It began to titter and giggle. At first quietly, but then louder and louder. Like a mean kid laughing at a prank. The cruelty in its high-pitched voice made my skin crawl, and I was about to snatch the headset myself and begin demanding answers when there was the strangest sound. A heavy grinding, like stone turning against stone. Before I could even ask what it was, Bea fell backwards from where she had crouched and quickly leaped up into a standing position and ran off into the dark like a maniac. The effect of the group was chilling, and as I stared back at the wall, desperately trying to understand what I'd seen. "Williams, go get her!" He barked at one of the soldiers before turning to me and crying. "What the fuck is her problem?" I don't know. Christ! Mikkel hissed before snatching the headset off of the confused young soldier. "Listen!" He growled into it. "I don't know who you really are, but you need to get someone in charge right now!" And that sound again. Loud and heavy. The grinding of heavy rocks being moved, the tiny stones came raining down into the cloud of dust. Something up there had disturbed them, and we stood in silence as they plinked off our helmets. Is that somehow moving closer? It's hard to say. I don't... The wall moved. A sudden and terrifying lurch forward. One that startled all of us and made me trip over my own feet. Terrified, I scrambled backwards from it as fast as I could while the handset continued to radiate that malicious laughter. "I think we need to go," I said in calm as a voice as I could manage. The wall moved again. This time it did not stop. The young soldier with the headset did not react fast enough. It came forward so quickly that it had him within seconds and knocked him to the floor with a heavy thump. And then it rolled over him, and it was... Well, if you're anything like me, as a child you might have wondered what happened to someone who got caught in an escalator. At the very top. I'm sure you know what I mean. Light was pouring, so I still don't really understand what happened, only that there was a lot of blood. And while it was quick, it was not quick enough because when the wall was about halfway up his spine, I could see the pain registered in his eyes. And that was the last impression that I had before Mikkel grabbed me by the collar and practically threw me back the way that we came. And then we ran. Running, plodding one foot after another. I don't know how long it went on for, but it was as if time had seemed to stretch on the way that only pain and tedium can induce. There were moments where, as I struggled to force one foot in front of the other, I wondered if I'd actually been running for days, not hours. There was no real way to mark the passage of time, only monotony. Books went by in a blur. The floor was featureless stone, the rhythmic sound of my feet losing all meaning, and behind us the wall, ever advancing with the horrible sound of grinding rocks, promising pain and nothing else. The only thing that I could actually focus on was the exhaustion, and that was self-defeating. More than a few times I wondered if I could just give up. And to this day I still have nightmares where I'm being chased down the corridor. It wasn't a quick pace, but it was quick enough that there were no other routes except forward, and thereon lay the torture of it. Because behind me was death moving at a brisk jog, and ahead of me was nothing. Just darkness broken by the erratic motion of a torch, and the entire time, which I would later realize was a good 2 hours, the only thing that I could think was, when am I going to lose this fight? When am I going to collapse? Or give up? And imagine my relief when, up ahead of me, I heard a familiar voice cry out,
What is your problem, lady?
Then I saw them. The young man held Bea by the shoulders while she tried to drag him through an open door. And that's when I remembered the little corridor with the severed heads. Not exactly the kind of salvation that I was hoping for, but it would have to do. And together, Mikkel and I grabbed both of them and threw us all through the opening, and seconds later, far too close for comfort, the entire corridor that we had been running through went pitch black. The wall overtook our positions, and we were left panting and exhausted on the floor where thousands of severed heads looked at us in annoyance. When we looked back the way that we came, we saw that there was nothing but pulsating flesh. A wall of it, hot and sticky and threaded with sickly blue veins. I don't know what that wall was, but something about the meat behind the stone made me think of hungry coral. It was a fucking trap, Mikkel hissed as he inspected the horrible mass.
I don't know how, but we were led down the wrong path. It swapped the cables or something. I don't know, but we have been lured down there like rats.
Where's Davis? The other soldier asked.
He is gone. What?
The older man gestured towards the wall of meat behind us.
Whatever the fuck that thing is, it got him. It looked like a wall, but it could move, and it just steamrolled him. Thanks for the warning, by the way,
he growled at Bea, but she showed no sign of understanding him. Instead, she sat on the floor and shaking, clearly in a state of shock.
Where now, sir?
The remaining soldier asked, and Mikkel grimaced.
Where do you think?
He spat before gesturing the route forward.
The only direction that is available.
The heads made for strange companions. They followed us with their eyes but did not stop their muttering. It was grating, to say the least. A noise you could ignore for maybe an hour or so, but pretty soon the papery rustle of their accented lips was the only thing that you could focus on, and no matter how hard you tried to push it out of your head. At least navigation was simple. Forward. The only way that we could go. We walked for about 6 hours before we took our first break. The corridor was wide. We stayed away from the heads and slept in a row, head to feet, while 2 of us stayed on watch. 6 hours each. I decided to stay up along with Mikkel, as Bea and the other soldier tried to rest. Bea had barely come out of shock during the journey, speaking a little towards the end. She told us, in a broken way, what she'd seen while kneeling by the wall.
Teeth, she said, and a face.
Although she wouldn't or couldn't elaborate on those 2 statements, I was left with the sense that she'd seen something that had come damn close to leaving her completely insane. And even as it was, I doubted that she had full recovery in her. She almost looked like a different woman. Baggy eyes, thinning hair. Or maybe it was just the conditions down there. Mikkel didn't look great either. I had to assume that I looked pretty rough too. Especially after the run. It had exhausted me, broken me. Not just the physical exertion, but the nightmare of it. The reason that I'd elected to stay on watch first was because I didn't want to sleep. A part of me was worried that I just dreamed about being back in the hallway, running from the moving wall, and I didn't want to revisit the place ever again. Not even if it was a dream. There were moments where I came so close to just giving up. I don't think that I've ever really experienced despair like that before. Not the kind where you feel your knees buckling and your neck turn to rubber as your head bows. It must be what people stranded at sea feel like, when they lose the strength to keep treading water. So instead I stayed up and I tried to ignore the muttering of the heads. Even tried talking to Mikkel, but he didn't have much to say. I could tell losing Davis back in the corridor had bothered him. Hell, it bothered me, and I hadn't even known the guy. But I swear to this day I can still see the look on his face as rock met flesh and his legs and hips just disappeared. In the end, I only had these kinds of thoughts for company. And lots of time. So it probably shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that I eventually fell asleep. It wasn't for long. 10 minutes at most. It was enough time for me to wake up and see something dragging the sleeping soldier's body into the darkness of the nearest shelf, his neck lolling unnaturally to one side. The movement was gentle, quiet, but clumsy too, like a child pulling a rag doll stealthily out of a toy box. I looked over to Mikkel and saw that he'd fallen asleep as well. So I nudged him with my foot and he woke up in sort of a lazy start. And only when he looked at me, confused for a few short seconds before slowly registering the look of terror on my face, did he seem to realize what was happening. I'm not sure what I expected him to do, really. But he was the leader and well armed. And I didn't want him to be the only one who had to figure out what to do next. Possibly because there was part of me tempted to just sneak off, to leave the young man to his fate. Maybe even Bea, if it just meant that I could survive a little bit longer. In truth, I was just relieved when Mikkel leapt into action immediately. I didn't want to be a coward. He jumped up and grabbed the young man's foot, and I ran over and I grabbed the other leg, and together we tried to pull him back. I didn't mention it to Mikkel, but the way that the soldier's body felt when I grabbed it, the muscles were too relaxed. Too heavy. I didn't know how to explain it, but if you ever end up in the unfortunate situation of moving a corpse, you might know what I mean. The living body supports itself. The dead one does not. It's just meat and water and somehow feels so much heavier for it. He was dead. But still we fought on. And at some point Bea must have woken up, realizing what had happened and joined in. And I remembered her trying to reach into the shelf to grab a hold of the dead man's arm when she suddenly flew backwards, landing with a hefty thud against the shelf beside her and rocking a few of the severed heads in their little stumps. Whatever was in the dark was clearly frustrated. It wanted its next meal. It wasn't going to let us stop it. And slowly a long, inhuman arm reached out and took a hold of the body's groin. Its strange hand had fingers that split at the knuckles 1, 2, and 3 times. Terrifying effect, especially given how each one moved on its own. A dinner plate monster of a hand attached to a lithe and muscular forearm devoid of hair. The second I saw it, it reached out in my general direction. I let go of the leg and I fell backwards, Mikkel continuing to struggle for a while, even taking out a pistol and firing a few shots in the darkness, but in doing so, he left only hand to cling into his comrade's corpse and lost his grip, and with almost no effort the body disappeared into shadow and we were suddenly down to 3.
What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck?
I wanted to say something. Maybe even something to comfort him. Or maybe an apology for falling asleep. But then again, he'd fallen asleep too. I didn't know what I was meant to do. I was in shock. And it was settling deep into me when Bea said something from where she remained on the floor. Her voice quiet, but oddly consistent. It isn't over. The hand reemerged carefully and deliberately, and placed itself on the floor, revealing more of the pale flesh that powered it. And then came another. And another. And then its head emerged slowly from the dark and fixed me with eyes both black, bulbous, and far too numerous for anything that could be called human. And its mouth. A beard made of dirty fingers. Gray and bluish, long, rancid nails, hundreds of them squirming like the mandibles of hungry spiders. Mikkel opened fire. Then he might as well have been shooting hay for the effect that it had. The bullet struck with a wet thwop, but no actual damage. The creature knocked him aside with pure contempt and pulled the rest of itself out of the corridor, where I saw that it had no legs, but instead relied on several long arms to suspend itself between the walls of the corridor like a kind of spider. One of these arms reached out and grabbed Bea, and by the time that she started to scream, it was already too late. Blood trickled from her ears, and there was the sound like a branch snapping. Her entire body went limp, and the monster dropped her where she fell to the ground, her grotesque, misshapen face glaring at me with accusatory eyes. The lieutenant screamed as he fired yet again, but then the thing seized him like he was nothing but a doll and lifted him, squeezing so tightly he dropped everything that he held, his gun and his torch hitting the ground with a loud rattle.
Help me!
He screamed while reaching out for me to grab him.
Jesus Christ, shoot the fucking thing!
I ran forward, crouching down in the hopes of avoiding its many arms. Already, Mikhail was being squeezed so tight that blood spurted from his mouth, and I could tell that the monster was having fun, reveling in his torment. I reached out to pick up the gun from the floor as Mikhail let out yet another desperate, wet cry for help, but for some reason my hand stopped mere inches away. I hesitated. Mikhail's blood was dripping down, and I could hear the crunching of his ribs. In my most shameful moment, I grabbed the torch, and I ran. And Mikhail's cries followed me. Screaming, screeching, whimpering sounds of breaking bones and tearing paper. Sounds of torture and torment that somehow seemed to last forever. And I emerged from the corridor alone. It took me only a few seconds of stumbling on my failing legs to realize that the monster had given up on the pursuit. And then a few seconds more for me to recognize that I was back on the mezzanine, terrified and exhausted, and contemplating if it was worth trying to escape, and if it meant having to spend another second alive in that place. And I fell to the floor and I began to sob. Maybe, I thought, it was time to take a dive off that ledge, just like Grant had. "What are you doing here?" And I whipped around to see an old man in robes staring at me like an impolite intruder. And without meaning to, I began to laugh. My sanity, it was fair to say, was on its final legs. He said while leaning aside to get a look down the long corridor behind me. "Now why did you go down there?" I wanted to answer, but I couldn't quite bring myself to do anything except laugh and gasp for air. "I think you'd really ought to go home," he said like a teacher admonishing a child. "This place is hell," I cried while rocking back and forth on my knees. Yes. Good for you. This is a small part of hell, and one that has a slight overlap with Earth, if I remember. I'm assuming that's how you got down there. The door. What happened to your friends?" I looked back the way that I came and I pointed. "Oh, I left your books out specifically so you'd find them and figure it out. And I know the bald fellow worked it out. Once he knew that this place was hell. Why did you waste another second sticking around?" I shrugged, not quite sure what I was meant to say to that sort of thing. "We got waylaid, misled." "Fair enough. Probably should have done more to make sure that you got home safely. And that is partly my fault. Although I won't apologize. You entered this place. Didn't you see the door? What part of that was inviting? You have to take some of that blame." I wanted to mount a defense, but I didn't really have one. And when it became clear that the only thing that I could do was sob and mutter, the old man's body language softened and he reached a hand out. "Come on. I shall take you back." What about the demons?" The old man frowned. "Those were not demons. This place is defunct. Mortal souls were meant to demonstrate repentance by wandering the near eternal halls in search of their books. Only when they were found were they allowed to move on. Whole thing didn't quite work out. 86 quadrillion books. Takes a tad too long for the average person to find theirs. So this entire wing was abandoned, and now there are only sinners left behind." "That thing was human?" "Nobody's soul looks human. Least of all the sort of person who gets sent to hell. This isn't a place for people who eat meat on a Friday or covet their neighbor's ox. It is for the cruel and the malicious, cowards and opportunists.
A lot of people in this place have souls that have more in common with anglerfish and trapdoor spiders than their fellow man. It's not a condition that gets better after several thousand years. The soul changes, twists, and so do their physical forms.
And what about you? Why do you look so normal?
Oh, that is because I built this place.
The last thing that I remember as he gripped me by the shoulder was the sudden and painful tension of heat. And we woke up in our respective quarters. We. All 6 of us. I still don't fully understand the mechanics. I tried asking the others how they made it back, but they weren't in a state to answer questions. Bea was catatonic, screaming and clutching her head in the hospital like she still remembered the way that the thing crushed her skull like a grapefruit. The soldier who fell in the wall was left paraplegic even though medical tests couldn't identify a single reason why. Psychological, they said. The other soldier, the one who had been dragged into the shelves, was comatose. I don't know if he recovered, but he was alive. And Grant was left in a permanent psychotic state, compelled to write on any surface that he could over and over again. Sin after sin, desperately trying to rewrite the very book that had driven him to madness in the first place. And Mikhail tried very hard to kill me. He had clear memories of being left to die in the dark. I'm glad that they caught him before he managed to write the life out. I'm glad that they caught him before he managed to wring the life out of me with his bare hands. I never found out what happened to him after several men managed to pry his hands from around my throat. And despite everything, I hope that he managed some sort of recovery. The door disappeared, thankfully with no one on the other side. I know they were planning future expeditions. It is for the best the kind of thing that can't happen again. So they have no idea what is waiting for them. And in a way, I probably could have convinced myself the expedition never happened. Some days, even now, that's what I sincerely hope can happen. There was no physical evidence. Nothing. We appeared in our beds, completely naked, save for a note that was stuck to my chest. And it's the final little touch that stood out to me as stern confirmation of everything that I'd experienced. Return to sender. 6 mortals. 5 were damaged in transit. Bodies were repaired to the best of my ability, but I never was any good at this kind of thing. Minds are another matter entirely. Could not help myself in one case. Left fellow mortal to die in the dark. Didn't seem very sporting. Don't let anyone say I lack a sense of humor. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. Best wishes. Me. My heart sank when I heard them read it to me. It confirmed my deepest worries. No one had been very honest with me since I'd arrived in the hospital. They had kept me bandaged up, so it wasn't easy to tell. But after I heard the note, I finally found the courage to reach up and remove the thick wads of fabric. And then, with shaking fingers, I finally touched my eyes. Or rather, the empty sockets where they used to be.